It started the way most real things do, not with fireworks, but with a fumble. Julian dropped a coffee cup at the community arts center, the sharp shatter echoing across the high-ceilinged room like a firecracker going off in a museum. He scrambled to pick up the pieces, murmuring apologies, swearing under his breath, brushing porcelain into his palms like it would make him bleed enough to reverse time. He didn't notice her at first, not until she kneeled beside him, calmly picking up the shards, one by one, without saying a word. Her hands were clean, precise, and somehow sad. When their eyes met, Julian paused. She had the look of someone who'd once made grand plans and had to cancel all of them. Lines around her mouth that weren't about age so much as things unsaid, and eyes that looked too clear to be comfortable. She was beautiful in a way Julian didn't yet know how to name. Not polished, not glowing. She looked like a photograph someone tried to crumple but couldn't throw away. Her hair wasn't colored, and her sweater had a hole in one cuff. There was something unfinished about her, like a song with a missing verse. He couldn't stop looking at her, not because she looked perfect, but because she didn't. She looked alive. Julian was 22, fresh out of a philosophy lecture, and full of chaotic purpose. The kind that comes with realizing nobody really knows what they're doing, and that maybe that meant you could get away with anything. Until reality hit like a mailbox to the face. He didn't want perfection. He wanted something that made him feel like time could be tricked into standing still. She made it stand still. Sorry, he finally said, trying to pull himself together, trying not to stare, failing utterly. It's just a cup, she said. Her voice had no accent, but carried the elegance of restraint, like someone who spent years keeping the volume low just to avoid being misunderstood. Not the end of the world. He asked her name. She paused like she didn't know if she should give it. Nora, she said, after a beat too long. I volunteer here on Tuesdays. He wasn't supposed to be there. A classmate had dragged him into the arts center to kill time before a film screening, but the classmate bailed and Julian stayed. He hadn't expected to see oil paintings that looked like open wounds, or a woman who made him forget what century he was in. She looked like the kind of person who remembered the sound dial-up internet made. That detail shouldn't have fascinated him, but it did. He came back the next Tuesday, pretending to care about gallery lighting. She raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. He talked about the texture of brush strokes, about the way silence moved in a room. She smiled politely. He made a terrible joke about existential dread being the modern artistic medium. She almost laughed. Then, after a pause, she did. Her smile arrived slowly, like she wasn't sure her face remembered how. It wasn't wide or dazzling. It was raw, almost embarrassed, like someone peeking through a curtain after years of blackout shades. I haven't smiled like that in years, she said quietly, almost to herself. And that was it. That was the moment, the climax of beginnings. Julian didn't know it yet, but he had cracked something open in her. Not her heart. That would be too easy, too sentimental. No, he had cracked open her silence. And that was much harder to put back together. The art center closed at 9. They stood on the steps under the orange wash of the streetlights. He asked if she wanted coffee. She shook her head no, but didn't leave. So they talked. About absurdism. About gallery pricing. About what it meant to feel tired without doing anything. She didn't ask about his age. He didn't ask why she kept glancing over her shoulder. The air between them wasn't electric. It was heavier than that. Like walking into a room right after someone had cried there. Every word felt like a risk. Every glance carried weight. Still, he came back the next week. And the one after that. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something. And it was already more than either of them was prepared to admit. Julian knew the moment things got real. Not when they kissed for the first time. Though that happened on a cold bench outside a shuttered bookstore, his fingers trembling with restraint, hers hesitating like the space between breaths. No, the moment it got real was when he saw her car parked outside a house he didn't recognize, with a name on the mailbox he did. Thatcher. He wasn't supposed to know she was married once, let alone that she still sometimes stayed there. He watched from the sidewalk, holding a coffee she'd never come to drink, trying to understand what the hell he was even doing. Nora never lied, exactly, but her silences were eloquent. She spoke around things, especially when it came to the past. I used to live on Birchwood, she said one night. What she didn't say was that she still visited Birchwood, that the man inside sometimes fixed her sink or paid her taxes, or that they'd once buried a dog together in the backyard. Julian wanted to be angry, but all he could feel was small, like someone trying to read a book in a language he never studied. They kept meeting in quiet places. The back room of the arts center, an abandoned overpass near the train station, the far edge of the lake where the light didn't reach past 7 p.m. Nora drove with the windows down and the radio off. Julian would talk just to fill the air. She rarely interrupted. When she did, it was sharp, precise, and often devastating. He once asked, "Why do you always flinch when I say your name?" She looked at him like he'd struck a nerve she'd spent years building bone over. "Because you say it like it means something." He never asked again. The whispers started in week 6. At first, they were background noise, casual sarcasm from Julian's friends about his mature taste in women. Then came the cafeteria joke, "He's dating his TA's mom." Julian laughed it off, but his stomach twisted. He wasn't ashamed, not really. He just knew they wouldn't understand. People in their early 20s see age like a prison sentence. Everything is measured in potential and expiration dates. Nora had already lived through a marriage, a miscarriage, and 2 decades of being reduced to titles. Wife, daughter, maybe even a widow. Julian hadn't even finished his thesis on Kierkegaard. The real trouble hit with the email. Subject: concern about student-faculty interaction. Sender: anonymous at campusada.org. Content: is it appropriate for a student to be seen regularly with a much older woman, especially given her community ties and his academic standing? Some are watching. Just thought you should know. Julian read it on a cracked iPhone screen in the library basement. The chill of the fluorescent light suddenly felt personal. He hadn't told anyone. Nora definitely hadn't. But someone had seen them. Maybe at the arts center, maybe at the grocery store where he grabbed her oat milk, maybe even at the park where she kissed his hand instead of his mouth. Someone saw and didn't like what they saw. That night, he didn't tell Nora. He couldn't. She already looked tired all the time. Her guard was always half up, like someone expecting a fight that never quite broke out. Instead, he asked her about the first lie she ever told. "I said I didn't want to dance," she replied, eyes on the road. "I wanted to. I just didn't want to look foolish." He reached across the console, touched her wrist. "You still afraid of looking foolish?" She laughed, not a smile, but a bitter laugh that smelled like old wounds. "I'm with someone young enough to be my son. I passed foolish 10 miles ago." Julian didn't speak. He just leaned back and stared at the stars out her windshield, feeling like gravity had changed the rules without telling him. A week later, a letter showed up in Nora's mailbox. No return address. Just one sentence. "Does he know who you really are?" She showed it to Julian without a word. He read it twice, his throat dry. "I don't know who wrote it," she said. "I don't care," he replied. But his voice cracked on the last syllable. The threat wasn't physical. It was worse. It was exposure. People around them didn't need facts. All they needed was the suggestion of something that didn't fit their comfort zone. A young man and an older woman loving each other quietly? That was enough to warrant judgment, speculation, and whispers that grew like mold. They kissed in her kitchen that night, surrounded by half-washed dishes and the faint smell of old lemons. There was nothing glamorous about it. His stubble scratched her cheek. Her back ached halfway through. They laughed, truly laughed, and then cried, almost in the same breath. It was clumsy, chaotic, human. "Do you regret this?" he asked, not looking at her. "No," she said, "but I fear it. Every day." That night, they locked the doors. But fear, once it finds a way in, doesn't knock. They started talking only at night. Not always on purpose. Sometimes the evening just stretched longer than it should, a conversation about art bleeding into one about memory, then drifting into the gray territory where both people forget which parts of themselves they'd planned to keep hidden. Other times, it was deliberate. Calls that started at 1 a.m., breathless from a dream or too much thinking, whispering across the miles like fugitives from the lives they were expected to lead. The nighttime gave them space. Not safety, but cover. Julian could admit things in the dark that daylight wouldn't forgive. "I used to think I needed to be seen to feel real," he said once, voice low through the phone. "And now I only want to be seen by you." That night, she didn't reply for a long time. Just the sound of her breath, uneven, like she was walking up invisible stairs. Then, finally, "That's a beautiful thing to say to someone who can't walk beside you in the light." He didn't sleep for 2 nights after that. There was a strange comfort in their separation. He in his chaotic student apartment, with peeling posters and roommates who couldn't keep a secret if it was stapled to their mouths. She and her quiet townhouse filled with books she'd never get around to reading again, a cat that no longer trusted her, and a life lined with polite disapproval. They were from different timelines, different stations, but somehow they met here, in the hour between guilt and longing, when the world was quiet enough to tell the truth. They weren't just lovers. They became confessors. Julian told her about his father, a man who praised mediocrity but punished mistakes. About the night he broke a window just to feel like something could shatter louder than his mother's silence. Nora told him about her sister, the one she stopped calling after a drunken birthday voicemail that ended with, "You gave up before life ever got hard." They had wounds like mirrors, different shapes, same reflection. It terrified them how easily they recognized each other's damage. "I don't want to fix you," Julian said during one of those long talks. "I just don't want you to keep pretending you're already broken." "Too late," she replied, not unkindly. "But I like the way you see me, even if I know it's temporary." They made love with the desperation of people who knew time wasn't on their side. Not melodrama, just a quiet understanding. He memorized the curve of her collarbone like it was a prayer. She touched his face like someone saying goodbye to a past they never thought they'd revisit. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, the spell cracked. It happened at the lake. They met at their usual spot, a clearing surrounded by trees, barely a parking lot, not a soul in sight. They kissed like people trying to remember what it felt like to forget the rules. She laughed, freely for once. And that's when the dog barked. They turned together, reflexively, too slow to hide anything. A man, late 50s maybe, wearing cargo shorts and walking a golden retriever, stood 10 feet away. His eyes narrowed. He didn't say a word, just watched, then turned and walked off, shaking his head. Julian felt the fear before Nora even moved. Her fingers stiffened in his. Her jaw set. She was gone emotionally before she even reached her car. They didn't speak for 3 days. When she finally picked up the phone, she sounded like someone rehearsing a goodbye. "Do you know who he was?" Julian asked. "No, but he knew who I was." "You don't know that." "I do." The silence between them was different now. Not intimacy, strategy. Like they were planning their own trial defense. Every call, every word, every breath felt like evidence someone else might use. Paranoia crept in. Nora refused to meet near her home. Julian stopped answering texts when his roommate was in the room. They were slipping, not from each other, but from the bubble they'd built. And the world outside that bubble didn't care if what they had was real. It only cared that it was wrong. She called him at 3:12 a.m. the following Sunday. He was half asleep, still drunk from a classmate's party, unsure if the pounding in his head was wine or dread. "I dreamed we were in Paris," she said, without greeting. "But not now. You were older. I was freer. We danced in a fountain. Nobody looked twice." He didn't know what to say. "Julian," she continued, "do you think we'd still find each other if we met later?" He wanted to lie. He wanted to say yes with conviction. But he didn't. He just whispered, "I don't know." It was the truth. And in some twisted way, that made her stay on the line longer. She didn't hang up until the sun rose. Nora didn't want to go to the gala. That year's Spring Artist Benefit was supposed to be a formality, a check mark on the community's social calendar. Hosted in the grand rotunda of the Avery Glass Museum, it promised champagne flutes, polite applause, and a silent auction where nobody wanted the art, but everyone wanted to be seen wanting it. She hated it. The artificial lighting, the false kindness, the way everyone smiled like their teeth were trying to escape. But she was on the board, and absence drew more suspicion than presence. Julian hadn't been invited. Students weren't expected at these things unless they were hanging coats or playing background cello. But he came anyway, dressed in a rumpled gray suit that didn't quite fit, with shoes too clean to have been worn much. He waited outside near the fountain, smoking a cigarette he'd pretended to enjoy. It was Nora who asked him to come, hours earlier, in a moment of weakness over coffee. She didn't say why. She just whispered, "Be there," and he didn't ask questions. Inside the glass ballroom, the night unfolded like something out of a poorly written play. Women in sequins and men with too much cologne. Waiters weaving through with trays of something cold and expensive. Nora stood near the sculpture exhibit, pretending to listen to a donor's rant about parking meters. She didn't notice Julian at first. He slipped in with the tech staff, nodded like he belonged. And then, Suddenly, there he was, standing across the room, hands in his pockets, watching her like the whole space belonged to her and only her. She froze. Someone called her name twice before she responded. When she finally made her way over to Julian, every step felt like defiance. "You shouldn't have come," she said under her breath. "You told me to," he replied. "Didn't expect you to look like this, though." "Like what?" "Like someone trying to disappear into the wallpaper." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened. "There are people here who—" "I know. I'm not here to make a scene." But fate didn't need help making scenes. Sometimes they write themselves. The problem was Lydia. She'd been Nora's friend once, back when they both taught occasional art history classes at the university. She'd seen Julian once before, during an open gallery tour, lingering just a little too long near Nora's elbow. Lydia had a way of cataloging details, storing them like live wires. That night, she had the mic for the evening's final speech, a brief thank you before the final auction item. She stood beneath a chandelier shaped like a frozen firework, smiled out over the crowd, and began. "Before we end, I'd like to thank our community leaders and benefactors, and those who remind us art has no age limit and no rules, apparently." A ripple passed through the crowd. Not quite laughter, not yet shock. "I'm speaking, of course," Lydia continued, "of a piece that wasn't supposed to be on display tonight. A portrait of contradiction, of boundary, of intimacy. Some of you may have already seen it, if you've passed the side hallway." Nora's eyes snapped to the east corridor. She had submitted the piece months ago and then pulled it. A painting, an abstract figure, faceless but familiar. Julian's posture, his hands, the way the lines curved toward her like a tide. It wasn't explicit, but it was honest. Too honest. Lydia smiled with teeth. "They say all artists paint the people they're afraid to lose." The silence was cavernous. Julian stepped forward, just once. Not dramatically, just to let people see his face. It was enough. Faces turned. Whispers began, not sharp but invasive, like fog rolling in through cracks. Someone near the back dropped a wine glass. The sound was small, almost mercifully symbolic. Nora didn't speak. She didn't move. For a second, she looked like the statue beside her, beautiful and rigid, hollow-eyed and breakable. Then, she walked to the center of the room, heels clicking like a verdict. She reached Julian, took his hand, and turned toward the crowd. There was no speech, no apology, just a presence. It was her way of saying, "Yes, it's real. Say what you want." The room didn't explode. It did something worse. It murmured. The kind of collective hum that's less about shock and more about judgment fermenting quietly. The crowd began to disperse in polite waves. Glasses were set down. Bids were forgotten. No one dared to confront them directly. They didn't have to. The damage wasn't in the confrontation, it was in the withdrawal. Back in the parking lot, Julian exhaled for the first time in an hour. Nora stood with her hands in her coat pockets, staring out at nothing. "I'm sorry," he said, unsure for what exactly. Coming? Existing? Not pulling her away sooner? "I'm not," she answered. Then added, "But I'm not proud either." "You don't have to be proud. You just have to be honest." She looked at him then, really looked. Her expression was unreadable. Tired, maybe. But there was something else, something rooted and unshakable. "I think we just bought our ticket out of this town." Julian half smiled. "You want to leave?" "I want to breathe." And for the first time since they met, the future felt like something they were allowed to say out loud. They didn't leave. Not right away. The idea lived between them for a while, blooming and rotting in equal measure. Some nights they'd talk about cities they might vanish into. Portland, Montreal, somewhere in Spain where no one asked questions and people made peace with time instead of trying to outrun it. Other nights, they wouldn't speak at all. Just lie there in the dark, back to back, letting silence do the talking. Because they both knew it. You don't just leave the past. You carry it. Like a phantom limb you still feel in the rain. After the gala, the walls didn't collapse. They just got closer. The emails multiplied. Some supportive, a few shockingly tender, most laced with a concern that felt like acid under the skin. "You're not thinking clearly. You're being used. This is going to destroy your name." They didn't specify whose name. That was the trick. The blame didn't care about direction. It spread like ink. Julian's department head called him in for a friendly conversation. Nora lost a gallery invitation she'd been waiting on for 5 years. Nobody said it was because of him. Nobody had to. Julian's mother sent a voice message, barely a minute long. I heard. I don't know if it's true. If it is, maybe talk to someone. A therapist. Or a priest. He didn't reply, just deleted it and stared out the window for an hour. One afternoon, he met his best friend Evan for beers behind the student union. Evan had always been blunt to the point of cruelty, which Julian usually appreciated. You're in love with her, Evan said, shrugging. But love doesn't mean it's right. Julian stared at the foam in his glass. Why not? Because it's a story, Evan said, shaking his head. It's a phase you'll turn into poetry. You'll grow out of her. She'll calcify. Wow, Julian muttered. That's real romantic of you. I'm not trying to be romantic, Evan replied. I'm trying to keep you from waking up at 30 with nothing but regret and some old love letters that don't make sense anymore. Julian didn't go home that night. When he finally saw Nora again, she was sitting on the back steps of her townhouse, legs tucked under her like a teenager hiding from the world. She was holding a letter. The envelope was cream-colored. Her fingers were trembling. He sat beside her, close but not touching. What is it? My sister, she said. She's not angry. She's just tired. Says I need to reconsider the patterns in my life. That I always choose people who make me feel young instead of safe. He watched her face. She didn't cry. That made it worse. Do you agree with her? No, Nora said. Then, after a pause, but I understand why she thinks it. He wanted to say something profound. Instead, he just asked, do you think we're hurting each other? Nora looked at him, slowly, like the answer had already been there, just waiting to be acknowledged. I think we're trying to prove something that doesn't need proving. And I think the world won't let us do that without demanding a price. Julian swallowed hard. I'm still willing to pay it. Her eyes softened. I'm not sure I am. That was the moment. Not a break. Not a scream or a door slam. Just a pause that went too long. A breath too held. The moment when people know love is still there, but life has started to outgrow it. Still, they didn't say goodbye. Not yet. Not completely. 2 weeks passed. They still called sometimes. Still met in the shadow of the arts center, just to look at each other like the answers might still be somewhere in the shape of their mouths. Then came the exhibit. Julian submitted his thesis, a mixed media piece he'd poured everything into. Memory, time, regret, silence. It got accepted into the university's end-of-year showcase. There were rumors about who inspired it. The faculty kept quiet, but the students didn't. That night, Nora showed up unexpectedly. She stood in front of his piece, staring at it for 20 full minutes. Nobody approached her. He came up behind her quietly. You came, he whispered. I had to. They didn't touch, didn't kiss, just stood in the noise of the room, surrounded by younger voices and curious glances. Then she turned, slowly. Her hand brushed his sleeve. Julian, if we end now, what part of us gets to stay? He didn't answer. So she did. The truth. That it happened. That I felt something wake up in me I thought was long dead. And that you. She stopped, voice thick. You reminded me I'm not a ghost. The lights above them buzzed. People passed. He leaned in, voice low. And you made me feel like I had weight. Like I wasn't just potential anymore. Like I was already someone. Neither of them said the word goodbye. It would have been too clean. They just walked away at different times, in different directions. 1 month later, Julian received a package. No return address. Inside was a single photograph, an old Polaroid of a woman in a green sweater, leaning on a windowsill, eyes closed in sunlight. He didn't know the story behind it. Didn't need to. On the back was a note in familiar handwriting. Some moments don't last, but they stay. He smiled. Not sadly, just honestly. And he never found out if she meant it as an ending, or a door still waiting to open.